In this video, I'm going to discuss Plato's metaphysics and epistemology. These ideas can mainly be found in the Phaedo dialogue, the Meno dialogue, and the Republic. In order to understand what Plato is doing philosophically, we first need to go back and talk a little bit about Socrates' legacy. Socrates' main concerns in philosophy were in philosophical methodology, or the way in which philosophy is done. This methodology came to be known as the dialectic, or the Socratic dialogue. The purpose of the dialectic is to test individuals' beliefs for consistency, especially those individuals who claimed to possess knowledge or claimed to be wise. If it turns out that individuals' beliefs are inconsistent, then that means that not all of their beliefs are true. But if not all of their beliefs are true, then not all of their beliefs count as knowledge. But Socrates was not only interested in testing people's beliefs for consistency. Socrates was also interested in ethics and making sure that individuals were living a consistent lifestyle. In fact, Socrates thought that consistent belief was necessary for living a consistent lifestyle. Inasmuch as Plato appreciates the dialectical method handed down by Socrates, Plato nevertheless recognizes that there were several sorts of topics and questions that Socrates left unanswered or left unaddressed. In many places, Socrates is content to eliminate possible answers rather than straightforwardly give his own answers. A perfect example of this is in the Euthyphro dialogue, where Socrates and Euthyphro are discussing the nature of piety. After several attempts to give a consistent and satisfactory definition of what it means for pious actions to be pious, or to explain what it is exactly that makes pious actions pious, Euthyphro is not able to give an answer. However, by the end of the dialogue, Socrates does not give an answer either. So the reader is still left wondering what exactly it means for pious actions to be pious. Plato's philosophy can largely be seen as trying to fill in these kinds of gaps. So, while there were a lot of topics that the historical Socrates himself really did not address, like whether or not there's life after death, or the specific nature of the soul, or the nature of ultimate reality, Plato thinks that in order to show how Socrates' method of dialectic has the best things going for it, he needs to give a consistent understanding of metaphysics, or the way that reality actually is. More importantly, Plato recognizes that he cannot be Socrates' devout pupil without also being his critic. So let's look at this example. Take a moment and focus on these two pictures of red apples. Clearly, the two pictures are distinct. Why? They're two completely different apples. However, they are also very much like each other. In fact, they're qualitatively identical to each other. Both of the apples are red. They're the same size and same shape. They both have one green leaf and a brown stem. Plato would point to an example like this and say, we recognize that the apples are different, but we also recognize that they have things in common. More specifically, there are properties that the objects share. Plato would point out that because we are able to recognize similarity and difference in the world, that we have some knowledge of universals. Universals are properties that distinct things can have in common. Plato thinks that universals are necessary to answer these kinds of questions. First of all, how can we actually recognize similarity and difference in the world? What it means for objects to be similar is to share properties in common, and what it means for them to be different is to have properties that another one lacks. But furthermore, objects can differ in the degree to which they possess certain kinds of properties. Two apples can be more or less red, they can be larger or smaller than each other, one can be more rounded, etc., etc. So since we recognize that there are features in the world that things can possess and lack in certain degrees, there has to be some kind of standard. It would make no sense to say that one kind of object possesses a property to a greater degree than another, or to say that one object possesses a property to a lesser degree than another if there were no such thing as that property. But since we are able to recognize similarity and difference in the world in this way, there must be some kind of standard or property that objects can share and instantiate to varying degrees. That's what universals are. Secondly, Plato's understanding of universals also accounts for the meaning of our descriptions. So what does it mean to accurately point at any kind of object and say, that is an apple? If there are multiple apples on the planet, but they are all designated by the name apple, that means that there have to be some facts about what makes apples apples as opposed to something else. And lastly, we can ask the question, how exactly can distinct particulars share in the same essence? So what is the essence of an apple? Well, whatever that is what all apples will have in common with each other. We could call this essence appleness, if you will. So appleness would be the ideal standard or the property, the universal or collection of universals that all apples share with one another. Plato calls these universals the forms. So for every meaningful name that we can give to something like apple or horse or cat or table or chair, there is going to be some ideal form which establishes the essence of what it means for the thing to be that kind of thing rather than another kind of thing. So all cats share in catness with each other, all tables share in tableness, etc., etc. Well, why do there have to be these forms? Well, remember, we are able to recognize objects that have properties in common, and we can't recognize this if there are no such properties. But since we can recognize this, there have to be such properties. Now, but what are the natures of the forms themselves? Plato says that in order to be at all, in order to exist at all, something must either be a form itself or it must participate with a form. So the forms themselves are universals, and they constitute the ideal essence of things. And things have those essences to varying degrees based on the degree to which they actually participate with form. Now, but it's also the case that every particular is what Plato calls a compresence of opposites. So any particular object is not only going to participate with one form, but many. Not only that, particular objects themselves can be improved upon in various kinds of ways, and they can also be degraded in various kinds of ways. So, particular things come into being at particular times. They don't exist independently of universals, but they're also subject to decay and degradation. But we know that there has to be some sort of essential standard or universal standard, and this standard must be perfect. However, if the standard must be perfect, then particular things that are composed of the compresence of opposites cannot themselves be the standard, and hence cannot be forms. But since forms do not consist of the compresence of opposites, forms themselves cannot be particulars. And if the forms themselves cannot be complex particulars, which are subject to time and change and potential decay and degradation, the forms themselves as the ideal standard or archetype must be simple, meaning they cannot be complex or indivisible. They must be timeless, meaning that they do not begin to exist or cease to exist. They need to be unchanging and perfect. They need to be transcendent, and they need to be independent. So Plato's theory of universals is not only that universals exist, meaning that there are properties that objects share in common, but also that universals exist independently of the particular objects that participate with them. Not all theories of universals are like this. Other philosophers are going to argue that either universals do not exist at all, or universals do not transcend the particular objects that instantiate them or participate with them. Now, you may ask, well, if the forms themselves as universals are timeless and simple and unchanging and transcendent and independent, how exactly do we ourselves, as particular human individuals, possess knowledge about such things? So, we cannot acquire knowledge of such things by examining particulars. Why? No particular thing can be the ideal or perfect standard. So any particular kind of object that you experience in the world, let's say a table, could be improved upon or could be corrupted. But if every particular, as a compresence of opposites, can be either improved upon or corrupted, then particulars cannot be the standard. But if particulars cannot be the standard, we do not acquire knowledge of standards by examining particulars. But it's also the case that our knowledge of the standard is necessary for us to make sense of particulars in the first place. If there were no standard, we would possess no knowledge of similarity and difference in the world. But we do possess such knowledge of similarity and difference in the world. Now, but if we do not possess knowledge of the standards, the forms, by having experiences of particulars, then that must mean that we are in possession of such knowledge prior to being born. But the only way for us to possess knowledge of the standard, or the constant, or the ideal, prior to being born, is if that we existed prior to our births. So what Plato does here is he establishes a strong connection between the nature of the forms as immaterial, simple, and everlasting, and we ourselves as immaterial, simple, and everlasting. So in order for you to exist prior to being born, you cannot be a body. You would have to be an immaterial soul. And that's exactly what Plato argues that we are. We have knowledge of the simple, the incorruptible, and the immaterial, and the independent and the transcendent, because we ourselves are that way. Now, you may wonder what kinds of implications this has for Plato's other areas of philosophy. Most importantly, what does this mean to actually know something? Well, here's where Plato is known for this phrase, that there is no learning, there is only recollection. When you think you are acquiring new knowledge of something, something that you did not possess before, that is actually not the case. What is happening is that your soul is being awakened to the knowledge of the form that it has forgotten by being embodied. Plato thinks that by becoming embodied, the desires and the conflicting sort of drives of the body weigh the soul down. So by becoming embodied, our souls get form amnesia, if you will. And it is the job of the philosopher, through dialectic and contemplation of the good, to come to be awakened to the forms and to remember what it has forgotten. This also impacts philosophy's understanding of what it means to educate. It is not your teachers' or your professors' jobs to get you to acquire or to possess new knowledge that you did not have before. That is impossible. Rather, it is your professors' and your teachers' jobs to engage you in line of questioning and contemplation, which will allow you to recognize your ignorance and remember the truth of the forms that your soul has forgotten. As a professor, I can't teach you anything new. I'm just trying to get you to wake up.